The early years of the First World War brought drama and hectic activity for Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George.
Lloyd George became increasingly prominent as he attempted to galvanize the national war effort.
Churchill oversaw the world's greatest navy and embraced war with gusto.
This is episode 4 of our series on Churchill and Lloyd George, The Swish of the Torpedo.
Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Professor Richard Toye. With me is Dr. Warren Dockter, the Asquith to my Campbell Bannerman.
Well done.
So, Europe in July 1914 was spiraling towards war. And of course, the famous assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June had consequences which spiraled out of control.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting here is in this moment when you might think that Churchill and Lloyd George would have lined up and thought, hey, we need to be on the same page, actually, it starts going the other way.
Yeah, this is absolutely right, because I think if we think about their respective political positions within the Liberal Party, then there were some really important divides between them as well as things that united them. So I don't think that it's totally helpful to think of this in strictly left-right terms. I wouldn't say that Churchill was necessarily the most right-wing person in the Liberal cabinet. Remember, of course, he'd been involved in the social reforms such as national insurance and so on a few years earlier. So he was in some sense socially progressive. But I would say he was probably the most militarist of the people in the cabinet. There were not any pure pacifists in the cabinet, people who thought that you shouldn't use military force under any circumstances, but there were certainly people who were far, far more skeptical of it than Churchill was. And Churchill was somebody who really enjoyed military spectacle and being, of course, directly involved in military action.
I mean, you can imagine how this is a real difference between Churchill and Lloyd George. So we know how Churchill was feeling in July because he wrote to Clementine, and in the letter, he said, everything tend towards catastrophe and collapse. I am interested, geared up, and happy. Is it not horrible to be built like that? So you can see him almost reflecting on the fact that, like, he's excited and he feels weird about it.
Yeah, that's very true. And also other people feel a bit weird about it as well.
Well, they feel weird about him being excited, I think.
That's what I'm saying, exactly. So this is, I mean, I think maybe he recognizes that is a problem too, that everybody else is wandering around gloomy and pessimistic and very anxious. And he can see that this is not necessarily good for his reputation to be the guy who seems very gung-ho. It's like, well, hey, war might not be such a bad thing.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And what's really, he's the guy that's like, no, that's terrible. I'd hate to go to war. I mean, it's real silly. But the seriousness of it is represented and I think reflected on more by Lloyd George, who in early August wrote his wife, Margaret, with a much more solemn note. And he wrote, and he said, I'm moving through a nightmare world these days. And I think what that is illustrative of, Richard, is the complete divergence of how they're approaching the matters of the First World War. Because up until this point, they'd really been morely focused on Ireland than global catastrophe.
Well, that, of course, is quite right. And I think also Lloyd George is very difficult to read sometimes because he was somebody who was a brilliant negotiator and somebody who was good at bringing different groups of people together. Some try to make them feel that they've got more in common than perhaps they really had and sort of do deals this way. And I think this is partly, it's not, when Lloyd George says he's living through a nightmare, I think it's not only about the fear of war itself, it is about being politically wrenched between different considerations. Now, remember that he was the guy who'd opposed the Boer War, and had put himself in personal danger when campaigning against it. And so this meant that his supporters within the government and within the Liberal Party more generally tended to be those who were on the anti-imperialist and anti-militarist wing. Now, at the same time, I think that Lloyd George, remember, we've spoken about his speech of the Agadir crisis in 1911, where he said that Britain shouldn't be treated as though it was of no account in the cabinet of nations. So he's got this sense of Britain as a great power, and
Right.
there is this thinking about why Britain might want to be involved in the First World War, which you'd think, well, why, what gain would it bring them? If you stand on the sidelines and let Britain and let France and Germany and Russia all sort of slog it out together, that is marginalizing Britain. So it's really he sees a competition between Britain's status, or the status it ought to have, and the natural instincts of his supporters. So I actually think that his position in this is, how do I nuance my position so that I can end up supporting the war without alienating my supporters?
Right, which is a really difficult political strategy to work, right? I mean, so you can see why he feels the way he does. And for Churchill, hitherto they'd been focused on the Irish question, like you say, that had been at the forefront of everyone's mind. I really like that how Churchill described the, I'm going to say, pivot or switch to the crisis in Europe. He described basically like the issues run down. The mists and squalls of Ireland faded as a strange light began immediately to fall and grow upon the map of Europe. And
Yeah.
it's a really poetic way to describe a lens change, I think.
Right. So they've been in this situation where there's this risk of civil war in Ireland, and that problem that problem doesn't go away. It has to be said. It is going to emerge again in spectacular fashion in 1916 with the Easter Rising. But this is really about how the Westminster politicians shifted their attention. The people in Ireland didn't necessarily say,
No,
"Okay, there's a war going on in Europe. Let's just forget about our existing concerns." But it does create this political space, and it is a bit like, one big problem is being blotted out by an even bigger problem.
right. Well, no, and amidst all this, right, you've got a situation, as you were just pointing out, where Lloyd George is in this really difficult political place. And it's interesting. Asquith noted that Lloyd George was a potential leader of the peace party. I mean, Prime Minister Asquith says on several occasions about how Lloyd George was for peace and that he's more sensible and statesmanlike, and that he reads him in part because of the way you were characterizing him, not as just a pacifist, but as someone who understands the importance of Britain's role in the world and in European affairs, and how it has to hold the traditional, I'm going to say, concert of Europe position as the leverage to keep the peace in Europe. But amidst all that, again, you've got Winston Churchill running around buoyant that there might be a war. And
Right.
so this increasingly creates tension, not just for Churchill and Lloyd George themselves as allies, but also inside the cabinet.
Completely. And so let's just kind of run down so that people understand what it was that everybody was arguing about. Um, After assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July, and then Russia, which was Serbia's ally, mobilized her forces in response, and then Germany, which is allies with Austria-Hungary, mobilizes in turn, ending up going to war with Russia on the 1st of August, and then declares a war on France on the 3rd of August. So the question here is, are the British going to support the French by getting involved? And they don't have a treaty obligation to support France, yet Sir Edward Grey, who is the Foreign Secretary, is saying that if the cabinet takes a non-interventionist policy, so he's just going to stand back, then he's going to resign. And at the same time, there is this big body of non-interventionist opinion. So this is the hideous dilemma which is faced, which is essentially, what do we do to back up the French, if anything. And if you've got to think that people are thinking political terms as well, because it's not just a what do we do in the abstract, it is a question of, is the government going to fall apart one way or the other? So if we stay out, there's going to be the pro-war people will resign. And if you go to war, then the anti-war people might resign, which creates a potentially chaotic situation just at this moment of maximum Europe.
Right. No, I agree. I have a question for you, Richard, that's just a diplomatic historical question, which is, would not Britain's commitment to France vis-a-vis Russia as a part of the Entente Cordiale, which I guess was signed in 1904 or 1907, wouldn't that obligate them to defend France and or Russia, or is that only maritime?
Well, they see this brings us to a key point, because it didn't have a formal obligation to go to the war in support of France, but it did have a responsibility to go to war in support of Belgium.
Oh,
Now, and so this is what actually provides, if you like, the solution to the dilemma. And so this is because the Germans decide to attack France via neutral Belgium, where Britain is a guarantor of that neutrality, then this creates a situation where Lloyd George can say, and other people who were skeptical of war can say, oh, well, this is a question of a small power, defenseless power, although a power with an absolutely massive empire, a brutal empire, one might mention in passing,
yeah.
but presented as sort of the rights of small nations being violated. And that is something which then supposedly creates a moral obligation on Britain to intervene in a way which otherwise wouldn't have existed. And so that is what actually brings the sort of the different sides together. And there's sort of one or two cabinet resignations in spite of this, but almost everybody can agree that defending plucky little Belgium is a sort of admirable cause, which actually gives people an excuse, if you like, for getting involved in this great power conflict, whilst saying, well, we're not doing it for great power reasons. We're doing it because we believe so much in kind of defending the weak.
Right. So to quote Jeffrey Lebowski, this aggression will not stand. But the interesting bit here is that also creates a political pretext, as you're sort of alluding to, for Lloyd George to be able to switch his position, right? Because now it's a moral question and not a great power reason, right? It's we have to defend this tiny little Belgium, which is, as you say, operating one of the most brutal colonial empires in Africa, maybe in human history at that time. But that's not how it's framed. Certainly not in the British cabinet. The
Right.
question then, I think, would have arisen about who will publicly make this case, right? Will it be Churchill saying, would you commit yourself in public to war if Belgium was invaded, whether Belgium asks for protection or not? Like, this is the conversation that's going on between Lloyd George and Churchill.
Yes. And so remember then that Lloyd George has been seen as the potential leader of a peace party within the cabinet. And Asquith, the prime minister, is conveniently, from the point of view of historians, writing passionate letters to a young woman who isn't his wife, called Venetia Stanley. And these all, or many of them at any rate, get preserved, and writes down what is going on in the cabinet amidst all the romance. I mean, there's debate about the exact nature of this relationship. But he was certainly telling this young woman lots of stuff which really he shouldn't have been doing. But he's telling that Lloyd George was all for peace, but it was more sensible and statesmanlike than the more radical people in the cabinet. And I think I would say here that Churchill doesn't really understand like the depths of what Lloyd George is up to. And so Lloyd George needs to be seen as consistent, as being keen for peace, but being very reluctantly brought round to being in favour of war. And so Churchill is sending him notes in the cabinet. This is on 1st of August, in this really critical phase where war is breaking out elsewhere in Europe. And you've got to imagine, for people who don't know how the British cabinet works, you've got about 20 people round a long table with the Prime Minister at the middle point on one side, and the more important ministers are closer to the centre of the table. And people pass each other notes. So this is the 1914 equivalent of surreptitiously texting your mate under the table during the meeting, right? But
Right.
people would actually do it quite openly. They would write something and they would, fold the piece of paper up and they'd say, pass this to Fred, or you pass this to Winston, right? So you
Yeah.
take the table. And these notes have been, or some of them at any rate, have been preserved. And so we've got Churchill frantically scribbling to Lloyd George, please God, it is our whole future, comrades or opponents. Like, this is going to be some huge breaking point. Or, I am most profoundly anxious that our long cooperation may not be severed. I implore you to come and bring your mighty aid. I mean, if I text you, next time I'm going to text you, I implore you to bring your mighty aid, will be when I want something.
Yeah. That is what you text me. That's your version of an SOS, is please bring your mighty aid.
Yeah.
But I mean, I've lost the point that I was going to say, but I just think that this is a really interesting moment between these two, because you can see Churchill's desperate to build this political coalition with Lloyd George in the heat of this moment. And but as Churchill, I mean, so this is also August 1st, the same cabinet meeting at which this is happening, the same meeting where Asquith's writing his girlfriend, which feels to me, by the way, like a security breach.
It is, for
You
sure. Yeah.
And so, but Churchill decides to basically unilaterally, against the wishes of the cabinet, mobilize the Navy, right,
Yes.
as First Lord.
And I mean, this is something which I suppose brings him a certain amount of kudos later on. And I guess that, thinking about Churchill's political position, that he's somebody who's actually maybe thinking about, it wouldn't be so bad to work with the Conservatives again. How the Conservatives feel about this is like a different question. But as I sort of recall it, your former PhD supervisor, John Young, wrote an
Yeah,
article that was suggesting well, the evidence is debatable, I suppose, but suggesting that Churchill was really manoeuvring to try and set up a coalition with the Conservatives at this point. So that is this action of mobilizing the Navy is something which he might well think is going to do him favors with patriotic opinion, and will allow him to claim later on that when the test came, the Navy was ready.
right. Well, let me ask you. This is also just a point. So he does this. He must have permission from Asquith, even though the rest of the cabinet has, I'm going to say, demurred. I mean, did Asquith just nod his head? Do we know how Asquith felt about this?
So he felt about what?
About him mobilizing the Navy.
Well, I'm not sure I've got the. I I think that was the thing where Asquith wasn't necessarily going to give a clear signal, yet by not disapproving would retrospectively say, yeah, that was okay. But
Gotcha.
I guess that this sort of Belgium issue, because the Germans have violated Belgian neutrality on August 4th, Lloyd George admits later on this was a heaven sent excuse for him to start to mobilize the Liberal Party and the public for supporting the war. And essentially, the British give an ultimatum to the Germans, which, I mean, I think they realistically, at the point that they make it, is not
Sure.
going to be accepted. But they have to wait for the ultimatum to expire, which it does so on at 11 p.m. on August the 4th. And at 10:30 p.m., Asquith, Lloyd George, Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, and another minister, Reginald McKenna, they're sitting in silence, waiting for the ultimatum to expire. And as Big Ben strikes 11, this kind of, terribly solemn moment where Britain is now going to be at war, in dashes Churchill, radiant, his face bright, to announce that he's sending mobilization telegrams to the fleet. And Lloyd George recalls in retrospect, you could see he was a really happy man. I wondered if this was the state of mind to be in at the opening of such a fearful war.
And I think that's something that we as historians have been arguing about, whether or not he was in such a state of mind ever since.
Okay,
And if you'll join us after the break, we'll continue to argue about it.
no, we won't, because that was the end of the episode.
Oh, shit. Stay tuned for the next episode where we'll continue to argue about it. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I've just got to get the right page up. Mm. Come on.
So we're at the torpedo and the wizard, right?
I think
Like
so.
October 1914? Yeah, because he did. Yeah, no, we just went through that to finish it off.
Okay. Sorry about the slow opening of the document. Got it. Okay. So who is it? Whose turn to open then? You must be. Okay. All right. So are we doing? What are we doing? The rest of the war now?
Yeah, that's, I mean, we're starting with the torpedo and the wizard.
Uh, okay. Yes. Right. Got right. We're doing what was labeled episode 3. Okay. So we're going to have to get through quite a lot in a short time. All right. So yeah. All right. Well,
Well,
let's
the other
do.
thing is, I mean, we've just done on the original brief, which was episode 3, we've effectively done the outbreak.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Very true. Yeah. Okay. Right. I'm just trying to think of a comparison. Um, yes. Well, what would be the appropriate American doughboy for?
Yeah. You'd be would you be a Tommy boy and I'd be a
I mean,
doughboy?
I'd be a Tommy Atkins.
Yeah, Tommy.
I've actually got a PhD student who's doing an PhD on the use of the term Tommy Atkins.
That's great.
So it would have been Tommy Atkins in this period. So welcome to another episode of Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Professor Richard Toye, and with me is Dr. Warren Dockter, the doughboy to my Tommy Atkins. How are you doing, Warren?
Doing great. Great to be here. Excited to get into World War I, not unlike Winston Churchill.
Yes, and fortunately for us, the physical danger is less, I hope. And so in the previous episode, we talked about Churchill's enthusiasm for the outbreak of war, which even he himself realizes is slightly problematic. But he is somebody who, in these first months of war, is desperate for action. And remember that at the outbreak of war, we have a new war secretary, somebody we've encountered before in previous series, Lord Kitchener, the famous Sirdar of Sudan, sort of great imperial hero in British terms. And he's a non-political figure who is brought in to the cabinet in order to give it a patriotic gloss. And he's the guy who you see on the famous posters, sort of Britain needs you, right? And then, of course, there's the Uncle Sam American version late of that. Actually, at the outbreak of war, there is considerable chaos, I would say. Lloyd George, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, does spend an awful lot of time really successfully averting a financial crisis through talks and interventions with the City of London and the Bank of England. And meanwhile, Churchill is really eager to get stuck into the action. And there's a great quote from Lloyd George, who regards him as sort of too wild and impulsive. He says, "Winston is like a torpedo. The first you hear of his doings is where you hear the swish of the torpedo dashing through the water." So he's somebody who is maybe adding to the political chaos of the autumn of 1914 rather than sort of moving.
Well, yeah, and I think you can see that in lots of ways. I mean, we talked about in the last episode how politically Churchill's like obvious desire is spoiling for a fight. And
Yeah.
it's not only is it freaking himself out, as he wrote to Clementine, but it's also freaking out other members of the cabinet. And he looks increasingly irresponsible and wild-eyed, I think, to those around him. And he doesn't help himself because in October, as we move into the autumn of 1914, I mean, he personally went to Antwerp to help be a part of and engineer its defense. And so he would be out in the action with bombs and stuff bursting around him, which I think didn't have the effect that he wanted it to have. I mean, he wants to be seen as a Napoleonic general, I think,
Yeah.
and that's not really how his friends see him.
Exactly. And of course, this is par for a course with previous episodes like the so-called Siege of Sydney Street, when he was Home Secretary, insisting on being on the spot, directing action against anarchists when really he ought not to have been there. That wasn't his role. And now there he is trying to personally direct defense of this key city in Belgium. Controversial about how much good it did or whether it actually trying to sort of delay a withdrawal, he actually ended up doing more harm than good. And this again is something which is hung around his neck for years. I mean, there are so
Yeah.
many episodes that he gets criticized for, but certainly for the next few years, the memory of Antwerp, which is seen as absurd even by his own cabinet colleagues, is something which is perpetually used as a stick to beat him by his political opponents.
Yeah, and I mean, you certainly see that with Antwerp, which is hung around Churchill's neck. But you also then have something that's genuinely very damaging to Churchill and his political legacy, really for the rest of his life, and that is his position around the naval attack of the Dardanelles against the Ottoman Empire.
Well, as you were saying, the Dardanelles campaign and the assault on the Ottoman Empire would certainly be an incredibly significant event in Churchill's career, very momentous, and we'll talk about it more in our next episode.
The Dardanelles campaign would change Churchill's career and shape his reputation.
While Lloyd George was engaging controversial maneuvers that split his party and put him in 10 Downing Street.
Join us to explore the second half of the Great War through the prism of these two great lives.
That's in our next episode, From Terror to Triumph.
And in the meantime, KBO. But also click like and subscribe because that feeds us.